Some of us struggle with Shakespeare, and understandably so. I want to draw your attention to the number of excellent resources I've shared with you that will serve you better, perhaps, than my musings here in getting your head around this play, its themes, and its big takeaways. In particular, I'd like you to check out myshakespeare.com. They have the full text of the play, Macbeth, is what we're working on, along with the videos, audio, scenes, and other crazy things like commercials for medieval weaponry. Also, although you know I loathe SparkNotes, their No Fear Shakespeare can come in handy with the more challenging passages. They place the original and the contemporary English translation right next to each other, so if there's something you don't understand, you can read it in more contemporary language. Also, any edition of Macbeth with a good gloss, that's when they tell you what the words mean in more contemporary language, is helpful. The Norton book is good with this, but so is the myshakespeare.com version of Macbeth, which contains the full text with glosses right underneath. Some of you may be asking, why am I having you read Macbeth? The first reason is that it ties together all the elements of literature we've studied this semester. This is one of the reasons I assume English professors in general love Shakespeare. Shakespeare's plays, although challenging to read for those who have not read many, have plots much like short stories or novels. They're written in poetic verse. Shakespeare's mostly using blank verse here, unrhymed iambic pentameter, if you recall, for most of this play. And they're performed like movies, where actors interpret the lines and act them out. In fact, part of the challenge of Shakespeare is that there's so much going on that it's hard to know what to pay attention to. The vocabulary presents a challenge, but when you get into the poetry, you have to think about the plot. What's going on? Why is this character saying this? What's her motivation? At every moment, we have to understand his work on several levels. On top of that, Shakespeare is constantly employing metaphors and similes, and these present images that set a level beyond what's on the page or the stage. The symbolic arena, the place where these concepts of justice, guilt, fate, and free will are given imagery through language. And these in turn inform us regarding character and plot. And let's not forget that while we've read graphic novels accompanied by images and watched films that have image and sound, now we're reading something that was meant to be performed. So this, like many of the works we've studied, will challenge you in different ways, I hope. Another equally important reason I'm having you read it is that it's thematically relevant to a number of readings we've covered in this course thus far. For one, there's the idea of justice. When talking about kings, justice is a far hairier situation than it is in, say, Gotham City, where laws exist that are beyond any individual leader's reach. In a kingdom, however, the king or queen is where the buck stops. Monarchs can make any rule they wish, and they are not subject to laws in the same way subjects are, even if it's true that there was an ongoing debate over this in Shakespeare's time. This debate ties into another issue brought up heavily throughout the play: fate versus free will. How guilty is Macbeth of his crime? Does the witch's prophecy call the crime into being? Is it their influence, or the influence of Lady Macbeth, that makes him do it? Or is Macbeth ultimately responsible for his own actions? Could he have at some point just put his foot down and decided that he's not going to go through with it? Well, in Act 1, Scene 3, he's not sure, stating in an aside, which by the way is when the actor speaks directly to the audience and the other characters cannot hear, of the prophecy. He says, quote, "This supernatural soliciting cannot be ill, cannot be good. If ill, why hath it given me earnest of success? Commencing in a truth, I am Thane of Cawdor. If good, why do I yield to that suggestion, whose horrid image doth unfix my hair, and make my seated heart knock at my ribs against the use of nature?" The idea of killing Duncan is a horrid image, he says, and is against the use of nature, he reasons. Meanwhile, Lady Macbeth speaks of Macbeth's nature and is afraid he won't be able to kill Duncan, saying he's, quote, "too full of the milk of human kindness," unquote, to go through with it. And these witches, the Weird Sisters, seem in every way to embody the supernatural, morphing into wind or bubbles, enchanting incantations and casting spells at every turn. Especially relevant to Shakespeare's audience is the use of the number 3. Look at their speeches in Act 1, Scene 1 and Act 1, Scene 3, and see how often things happen in threes. This is directly relevant to the Christian doctrine of the Trinity and allows viewers to see these witches as performing inversions of Christian ritual, and thus they become agents of evil or satanic forces. And Lady Macbeth, when learning that Duncan has come to stay with them, puts forth a kind of prayer, a kind of black mass, saying, quote, "Come, you spirits that tend on mortal thoughts, unsex me here, and fill me from the crown to the toe, full of direst cruelty," unquote. In this way, she aligns herself with the Weird Sisters as instigators of chaos in the world. Her affinity with the Weird Sisters is made in other subtle ways too. For example, later on in Act 4, the Weird Sisters will give us some of the most quoted words in all of Shakespeare, quote, "Double, double, toil and trouble," unquote. Those lines are echoed when Lady Macbeth first greets the king in Act 1, Scene 6. She says that in preparing for his visit, quote, "Every point is twice done, and then done double," unquote. Also, back to the "unsex me here" speech, she asks the spirits to, quote, "take her milk for gall," unquote. In other words, she wants the most nourishing thing that her body produces turned literally into bile. As we can see, this idea of milk, coupled with other fluids, blood in particular, presents a spectacular series of images that it's worth to pay attention to here. Keep this in mind in Act 2, when blood plays such a prominent role. But back to the point. Is Macbeth the victim of the Weird Sisters, or of Lady Macbeth? Or is he himself responsible for committing the absolute worst crime a person can commit? That is, killing not only a king, but a guest in his own home, as Macbeth himself contemplates in Act 1, Scene 7, just before he tries to back out of the scheme. And in this, we may be reminded of Bruce Wayne and Regan Thompson, two characters who, while not villains, quite the opposite maybe, seem to be controlled by forces beyond them, by parts of their personality hidden in shadow. And we can wonder, would these generally good characters be responsible for their actions if their alter egos were more like Joker than that of a superhero? I mean, here in Act 1, Scene 2, Macbeth is portrayed clearly as a hero, victorious on the battlefield and a friend to Duncan. It doesn't take long for fate or ambition or vanity to take over. By the second act, Duncan is dead, and Macbeth has killed him. So this leads us to ask a simple question. What kind of character is Macbeth? What do we see when we look into his soul? It may be that we see a pair of Macbeths, a man deeply in conflict with himself. In Act 1, Scene 3, Macbeth, as mentioned above, seems rather uncomfortable with the witch's prophecies, but by the end of Act 1, Scene 4, without the influence of Lady Macbeth, he says in an aside the following, quote, "Stars, hide your fires. Let not light see my black and deep desires. The eye wink at the hand, yet let that be, which the eye fears, when it is done, to see," unquote. Which is a really cool way of saying that he has desires deep down inside of him that he's trying to suppress, but ultimately he's afraid he might not. Those desires obviously involve killing Duncan and becoming a king. This is contrary to the way Lady Macbeth sees him directly after with her human kindness soliloquy. Also note that Lady Macbeth tells Macbeth that he looks deeply disturbed just after this and tells him to, quote, "look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent under it," unquote. So clearly, there's a conflict between how others understand Macbeth and his own deeper understanding of himself. As he says in Act 1, Scene 7, quote, "I dare do all that may become a man. Who dares do more is none," unquote. In other words, he wants to live honorably and do the right thing, things that become a man. But he refuses, temporarily, to do more than that. Lady Macbeth, though, dresses him down, attacking his manhood, and makes him brave. And he ends up saying, quote, "False face shall hide what false heart doth know," unquote. But that brings a big question in for readers and viewers. What is false and what is real when it comes to Macbeth? When is he acting? We asked this in Birdman, but we see it come up here as well. When in Act 2, for instance, Macbeth says, quote, Had I but died an hour before this chance, I had lived a blessed time from this instant. There's nothing serious in mortality, unquote. Banquo and Macduff are supposed to understand it as a statement of sadness of the death of the king. But we know what he's really saying, that he regrets what he did, that he'd lived a good life until he'd committed the murder, and that now he must become a kind of nihilist, living a life with power, but without meaning. By taking the life of his king, he has made his own insignificant. Also in Act 2, he's hallucinating daggers and he's unable to pray, witnessing a, quote, dagger of the mind, unquote. And this gets us into some really interesting territory explored in Macbeth. Where does evil begin? Is it from the spirit world? In other words, Satan or supernatural forces? Does it originate in the mind? Or does evil begin when we enact it in the body, when we do evil things? Is having evil thoughts the same as performing evil deeds? Where is the line that separates them? There's a continuity between the foul acts of humans, the natural world, and the supernatural world that, as modern people, is unusual to us, but probably Shakespeare's audience would comprehend. The owl's cry, for example, at the time of Duncan's death, would be deeply symbolic. Owls, of course, are animals that hunt in the dark of night, that prey on helpless creatures. Is Macbeth the owl here? The owl's screech reminds me. See how the sounds play such an important role in Act 2? The knocking at the gate is like these characters' guilt coming for them. For an in-depth exploration of this moment, read Thomas de Quincey's On the Knocking at the Gate in Macbeth. I've provided links for this, and it's also in the Norton edition. But it's worth knowing, at the very least, that after having done the deed and seeing what he's capable of, Macbeth says, quote, "Every noise appalls me," unquote. He suddenly has everything to fear, and he immediately regrets killing Duncan, wishing that the knock would wake him. And later we have screams and, quote, hideous trumpets, as Lady Macbeth calls them. Also, we end Act 2 noticing that Duncan's death is accompanied by many horrible and unnatural events. An owl eats a falcon. I'll let you chew on the symbolism there for a bit. And Duncan's horses eat each other. Both of these images depict devouring that happens in unnatural ways, reflecting Macbeth's murder of his own monarch. What that does to this character we've been contemplating, and to the kingdom he will come to lead, will be the subject of the next 3 acts.